Vinod, thank you so much for that really warm introduction. It's really wonderful to see all of you here in person and to know that there are dozens of you joining us online. Cela me fait le plus grand plaisir d'être avec vous ce soir, en personne, avec les dizaines de personnes qui sont en ligne avec nous ce soir. Bienvenue, welcome to the EquiTalks. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation for those whose territory we are meeting on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who've been living and working on the land for a very long time. It's a way that we raise awareness of Indigenous presence, land rights, and human rights in everyday life. As an organization that works around the globe, at EquiTalks, we recognize and affirm the rights of Indigenous people worldwide. Tonight, let's just take a moment. Let's take a moment to be grateful and to recognize that we're meeting on unceded territories of many nations, including the Mississauga of the New Credit, Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and Anishinaabe First Nations. The name Toronto is derived from the word Takaranto, which means where the trees are standing in the water. At EquiTalks, we work coast to coast to coast and internationally, and our main office is located in Jagahage, Montreal, located on the unceded Indigenous territories of the Kahanni-Kahaga Nation. EquiTalks, the International Center for Human Rights Education, is a recognized global leader with over 55 years of experience in community-led social justice work. In a time of divisiveness, we know that educating people about human rights leads to real dialogue. For example, here in Toronto, we support a youth-led anti-racism hub that is a space for young people to speak up and speak out about issues that they face and find solutions that they can imagine that will build more right-respecting communities. Every year for the past 10 years, EquiTalks has hosted a series of public engagement events to spur people like yourselves, to reflect on participation, inclusion, gender equity, respect for human rights. And these events, which are now called the EquiTalks, are also an opportunity to draw attention to the steadfast work of human rights defenders across the world. In 2021, EquiTalks published, in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a compendium presenting good practices and lessons learned. Tonight, we are proudly celebrating the launch of this co-publication called Bridging Our Diversities. It takes a deep look at promoting gender equality, building equitable, inclusive communities, supporting reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, and engaging people who make decisions. This evening is actually the second in a series of two. The first was held on October 5th at the United Nations in Geneva. And during this event, Mr. Clément Voulet, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association, underscored how educating people about human rights makes vibrant civil societies. Here is a short clip video where you'll see some of Monsieur Voulet's inspiring words, as well as other panelists, notably Ms. Tenute, who's with us here tonight, to speak about their practice and to speak about what gives them hope. I invite you to watch the video for a few moments.
Thank you for being with us at this side event to the Human Rights Council, EquiTalks, Bridging Our Diversities Through Human Rights Education.
On behalf of the Permanent Mission of Canada here in Geneva, I just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to all the delegations and the civil society representatives who are able to join us this afternoon. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout.
In the past 25 years, human rights education has gained momentum in so many respects.
Let me start by congratulating EquiTalks and OSHR on the launch of this important joint publication on Bridging Our Diversity, a compendium of good practice in human rights education. These reports provide an important guidance on human rights education programming, and it comes at a crucial time as the world is facing extreme division, crisis, conflict, and social injustice. Human rights education is not only important to raise awareness about certain rights, but it's also important to strengthen the protection of human rights. It helps for the establishment of a human rights culture where human rights are understood, defended, and respected by all. Human rights education also creates an important safe space for dialogue between different groups, civil society, community, and governments.
IDDH has been working for 18 years now, fostering human rights education in Brazil and Latin America through the use of the human bodies and mechanisms. The concrete benefit of this was that Brazil really began after that time to participate more at some international forums addressing specifically human rights education, not only the right to education, but human rights education as an important component of the right to education.
Human rights education has been so integral within the process of advancing reconciliation in this country. When we look at human rights education specifically, we want to really look at it from an anti-oppressive and anti-colonial narrative. And now human rights education is phenomenal at this in terms of it really sets the agenda of enabling settlers to relinquish positions of power and powers of position and spaces in which they typically occupy to really allow for Indigenous youth to thrive.
It's a pleasure to be in this audience, which is initiated by EquiTalks, as well as the Human Rights Education Unit of the Office of the High Commission, both of whom have at different points of time been very instrumental in encouraging our human rights education in schools program in India. But what was most important for the program in terms of really creating impact for the teacher education component, where we had to ensure that an understanding of human rights was first provided to the teacher. So the teacher would ensure that the classroom relations, which are actually power relations, ensure that the power relations is thrown off and the teacher and the student are able to communicate much better.
That encourages both Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies to come to the table to really start to think of, what does the next 7 generations of this country look like?
Every country should have an open space as a committee or a commission to dialogue with civil society and educators about human rights education policies.
It's important for people to understand that if you want to live in democratic society, if you want also to ensure inclusiveness, you need to accept certain level of disturbance. When people know about their rights, they need to exercise it.
I am internally hopeful, and I think I see, especially that I'm so privileged to work with Indigenous youth, that they are the prayers of our ancestors, and they're the ones that they sang about, and they're the ones that are going to lead great change.
It is always a great honor, I believe, for the members and observers of the Human Rights Council to see how something that is usually just black letters on white paper in the Council actually comes to life when it reaches the civil society, non-governmental organizations, human rights defenders on the grounds across the globe. So sincere thanks for your work that you're doing in order to make sure that the human rights education is not only a Human Rights Council resolution, but also something that you live and practice every day.
Around us, we are witnessing ever-increasing polarization that creates real barriers, as mentioned by several of the panelists. The need to move away from withdrawing into oneself and instead to be open to others, open to difference, is palpable. The way out of the layers of global crisis, be it economic, climate, health, will only be achieved through a concerted and collective approach between governments in dialogue with communities that represent people who experience marginalization. Openness leads to dialogue, and dialogue will lead to solutions for all of humanity. In the midst of crisis in this world, we can be inspired by the day-to-day work of people who are educating themselves and others about human rights to influence decisions. And that's precisely what we're going to do this evening. We're going to learn more together. Join me in giving a very warm and heartfelt welcome to our moderator, Vinod Rajasekaran, CEO of Future of Good, our guest speakers. So we have Ria Hada, the Chief of Equality, Development and Rule of Law section of the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, who unfortunately had some flight delays and was not able to be here in person, and so we'll be calling in from New York. Peter Flegel, who is Executive Director for the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, who will also be dialing in remotely. We have Hillory Tenute, Executive Director of Canadian Roots Exchange. Marie-Claude Landry, who has come with us as the Chief Commissioner and Chief Executive Director of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Merci d'être avec nous ce soir. This event would not be possible without your participation and without the participation of those who are online with us, and without the generous support of our sponsors. So I'd like you to join me in thanking TD Ready Commitment, who's been supporting our work with children and with young people across Canada for many years, and we're very grateful for this steady support. For Bell, thank you for hosting us here on this magnificent view. Feeling very lucky this evening, and thank you for your partnership with us and your commitment to the well-being of communities across the country. And for Power Corporation of Canada and BGIS, we're two socially responsible companies committed to supporting human rights. Welcome everyone, enjoy your evening, profitez bien de la soirée et de ce moment d'échange qui est précieux pour nous tous et toutes. Over to you, Vinod.
Merci, Hada. That was an inspiring video. I want to watch it again. Congrats again on the launch of the compendium. Incredible work. Let me introduce our next speaker, Peter Flegel. Peter Flegel is the Executive Director of the Government of Canada's Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, a cornerstone of Canada's anti-racism strategy. Peter has a distinguished career as a social entrepreneur, a fundraiser, columnist, community organizer, and musician. He has a history of leadership in the government, NGO, and philanthropic sectors, in areas including anti-racism, equity, human rights, innovation, culture, international affairs, and entrepreneurship. Peter, a very special welcome to you. Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui. Je me joins à vous à partir des terres non cédées et traditionnelles du peuple algonquin-anishinaabe ici à Gatineau. So it's really a joy for me to be with you and really highlighting the centrality of human rights education, norm, values, and virtues to establishing the types of societies that are human-centered, equitable, safe, racism and oppression-free, as well as prosperous for everyone. Human rights education is central to that process. And also the importance of decoupling our conception of human rights education away from the kind of traditional, purely institutional perspective, to recognizing that it is a continuous, lifelong process that happens inside and outside of formal educational settings, as you well recognize. So I can speak a bit about myself. My human rights education was an active one, really, and it started at the, I can remember I was 3 years old and focused it around the active citizenship, as my mother brought me to my first demonstration against nuclear proliferation. So I can remember holding hands in the street with people really much older than me and adults, calling for the end of nuclear proliferation. So that was a decisive moment in my life that was so significant that I remember it as if it was yesterday. So example of outside of the classroom human rights education. My second one was experiencing the torment of racial and gender-based harassment and bullying for being Black and queer in preschool. And my third is discovering the concept of self-determination by reading at the age of 11 the history of my country of birth, Haiti, which, as many of you know, established the first independent nation in Latin America, the first Black nation, independent nation in the world. And so to see that my great-great-great-grandparents had defeated the three most powerful armies of the 18th century to create an autonomous, free nation, abolish slavery, and also help to liberate the rest of Latin America was really a source of pride for me. But it was not simply a matter of pride for being, a Black person or person of Latin American background, but in constructing the new nation, it was really, and drafting the Constitution, made it clear that Haiti was to be a land of freedom for all oppressed peoples. And so really the universalization of human rights, of Blackness, that was at the heart of the lessons that I drew throughout my career and my experience as an activist in a variety of human rights, civil society, and cultural spaces in Canada and internationally. So a few words about human rights education. which is necessary, if not imperative, in the 21st century. You heard a bit about it earlier on, since we're living at a time and in a country that still suffers from the legacy of some of the most atrocious cases of human rights abuses of the last millennia, which includes slavery, this transatlantic slave trade, the enslavement of indigenous peoples, the dispossession of indigenous lands, racial segregation, the Indian residential schools, which is seen, which still has an impact today and is seen as a legacy which is embedded still unfortunately today within our public institutions in the form of, among other things, systemic racism. And another element is, of course, COVID-19, the pandemic, which we're hopefully getting out of, revealed for everyone who doubted it that the extent to which racial and gendered and economic inequalities persist in Canada and were exacerbated during the pandemic. The evidence shows that Black populations, for example, have the highest infection and mortality rates related to COVID. Asian and Jewish communities were blamed and attacked for COVID-19. Muslim communities were targeted by acts of terror and intimidation, and there was the discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children and former Indian residential schools, and as well as the tragic death of Joyce Echaquan, which drew our attention to systemic anti-Indigenous racism. But also, and this was mentioned earlier, is we saw far-right white supremacist groups attempt to create a national movement with mainstream appeal to launder their fascist and ideology of terror on an unsuspected Canadian audience. And so it cannot be a coincidence that a lot of attention is focusing on education, formal education today, attacks on efforts to enable students to understand what racism is, what misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, classism are, just to name a few. There's a clear effort, and really part of an effort also to see more Canadians succumb to the siren call of authoritarianism, liberalism, and hate. So at the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat over the last few years, we've been engaging with thousands, if not tens of thousands of stakeholders who have spoken to us about the importance of human rights education and to make sure it is much more available to people in Canada across the country. And so we are trying to do our part of the Secretariat by we've developed an anti-racism framework which offers educational tools for public servants, for all business lines, to make sure that anti-racism from an intersectional, anti-oppression, equity, and human rights perspective is embedded in everything that the federal government does. We're also working with our colleagues, and really thanks to engaging with many of you who are on the call today, in developing a new anti-racism strategy for Canada and Canada's first ever action plan in combating hate. These are some examples, but what's really key here is the need, as has been highlighted earlier, to be able to work with you, the government working in partnership with civil society, because you have not only the lived experience, but the expertise on the ground and nationally and internationally that we need to rely upon to make sure that we're creating the right policies, programs, services, and legislation that are grounded in human rights and human rights education. So I want to congratulate EquiTalks on launching the compendium, Bridging Our Diversities, and signal that we are looking forward to continue working together. Congratulations, merci.
Thank you so much, Peter, for highlighting the centrality of human rights education, both inside and outside formal institutions, and in particular, for highlighting how COVID has amplified and exacerbated inequities across the country, and really excited to hear about the initiatives underway across the federal government. It is my honor to now introduce our keynote speaker, Marie-Claude Landry, Chief Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Marie-Claude Landry has been the Chief Commissioner and the Chief Executive Officer since 2015. In addition to her active law practice and rich background in community service, Madame Landry was a member of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for 10 years. She was also awarded the distinction Avocat émigré from the Quebec Bar. Madame Landry is an avid advocate on behalf of communities in vulnerable circumstances and frequently speaks out on human rights issues in Canada. Bienvenue.
Okay, then thank you so much, Vinod. Merci beaucoup. Merci. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. It's an important event, important conversation. And these in-person events are something I no longer take for granted after the past 2 years we have to live through. And I love really the energy of being in person, being here in the physical space with each and every one of you. And thank you as well for all those who are online and take the time to listen and be part of this conversation. I really want to begin by recognizing the land upon which we gather today. From me, land acknowledgements are so much more than a formality. They are an opportunity to reflect, and they are a concrete action that we must all take towards reconciliation and understanding our collective past, present, and future. For thousands of years, this land has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still be home to many diverse Indigenous people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This evening's event recognizes a great achievement that has been in the works for over 5 years now. The Compendium of Good Practices is the result of diligence, commitment, and collaboration by EquiTalks and your various partners, all in the name of human rights education. It has made me reflect upon the past 5 years and how much has changed in that short time, not only across the human rights landscape, but across the world. Back in 2017, there were no pandemic, not even a thought of it. The Me Too movement had not yet fully galvanized around the world. George Floyd's life had not been taken from him. The unmarked graves of thousands of Indigenous children at residential school sites had not yet been uncovered. 8 motivated attacks, such as Christchurch Mosque in New Zealand, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the Toronto van attack had not yet happened. The Black Lives Matter movement had not yet gained international preeminence. 5 years later, we are looking at an entirely new human rights landscape. And yet, so many of the key human rights challenges the EquiTalks highlighted in the 2017 declaration are still prevalent in Canada. Except now, many equity-deserving groups in Canada have also had to bear the brunt of the pandemic, the brunt of the housing crisis, the brunt of the rise in populism and hate in Canada, here in Canada. I guess my point is this, that after 5 years of historic human rights progress and a groundswell of social movement and public protest, human rights education is more important than ever before. We all have seen a momentum over the past 5 years that has brought key human rights issues to the forefront of the public discourse. Issues such as the human rights of Indigenous peoples and the need for reconciliation, the reality of the systemic racism in Canada, the need for action to remove barriers faced by people with disabilities, especially during the pandemic, the rise in online hate and the real-world hate crimes, the issue of gender inequality and sexual misconduct in the workplace, and the human right to housing and the rights of the most vulnerable people in Canada. It has been an historic period for human rights action and awareness. And now it falls upon us to keep the momentum going, to not let it slip. And we are here today to talk about how important human rights education is to maintain that momentum. As the leader of an organization that is charged with fostering public recognition of the principle of equality, here is what I would like to share about the importance of human rights education. 1, Human rights education is the key to dismantle some of the most deeply entrenched belief structures of racism and colonialism in our society. 2, human rights education is most effective when it's home for people. And 3, human rights education must be lifelong. When you think about some of those historic social movements that I mentioned earlier, the Me Too movement, the outpouring of action and outrage in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the national outrage over the unmarked graves at the residential school grounds. The common thing that links these movements is that these issues all hit home for people. Suddenly, the issue of inequality was made human to people who thought that it could be my son, that it could be my sister. As international human rights lawyer and author David Matas puts it, when discrimination is happening to others, many people do nothing. But when it is happening to someone you feel connected to, it is easier to care. It is a difficult but important truth. Empathy breeds action. When human rights issues hit home, that is when opportunities for introspection and education happen. I think this is what Eleanor Roosevelt meant when she famously said that human rights start in small places close to home, so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. I think she meant that human rights education begins at home, around the kitchen table, that it happens between colleagues over a coffee, that it happens in those uncomfortable moments when we need to gently correct someone or be corrected ourselves, that it happens amongst trusted friends, choosing not to laugh at an intolerant joke. And that this is something that we must keep learning over and over and over again, all through our lives. These are all moments of human rights education. It is about tapping into our capacity to learn and unlearn, to listen, learn, and self-educate, to have the courage to be uncomfortable, to admit when we need to learn more, to ask the brave questions, to keep ourselves in check. And this must be lifelong, and we must be vigilant about it. We cannot slip, and we cannot relax. As Simone de Beauvoir said, when she spoke about women's rights, she said, "Never forget that it only takes a political, economic, or religious crisis for women's rights to be called into question. These rights can never be taken for granted. You must remain vigilant throughout your life." Of course, she's right. Not just about what is at risk for women's rights, but all human rights. And we are seeing evidence of this all over the world right now. We are seeing an historic regression of human rights. And Canada is not immune. Because with all of the literature available to us today about the neural connection to intolerance and how deeply bias is embedded into our brain, what we know for sure is that intolerance, bias, racism, bigotry, it is all learned, it is taught, it is handed down, it is picked up. And only ongoing education in our homes, in our schools, and in ourselves can correct it. What we learn, we can unlearn. It reminds me of a phrase that was repeated during the early days of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When many people in Canada were first learning about how the chronic inequality facing Indigenous peoples today could be traced back 100 years to the atrocities done by the residential school system, we started to hear the phrase, education got us into this mess, education will get us out. It is a powerful phrase, I believe, coined by Chief Littlechild. And I argue we can apply this thinking to our conversation about human rights education more generally. In my 7 years and a half as a Chief Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, this has been confirmed by countless experts. They taught me how implicit bias works and how prejudicial thinking occurs. They also maintained very strongly that people can unlearn the intolerant thoughts that they have been taught. Our brains can be rewired through persistent education and the broadening of one's minds and social experiences. In other words, if education got us into this, education can get us out. I will touch more specifically on some human rights education practices later during our panel. But just before that, one final important note. This is key. Human rights education and the retraining of our own thinking and the thinking of those around us cannot be a one-time thing. It is not a scuba certification that you do once and you're set for life. This must be a lifelong learning. It must be ongoing. That is the only way that it works. The conversation about human rights is never over. We all have the responsibility to be human rights learners. We all have the responsibility to be human rights educators. We all have the responsibility to be human rights ambassadors. And we all have the responsibility to stand up for human rights. We are here this evening because we share a common goal for promoting human rights. So let's ask ourselves, each and every one of us, what will we do after this event to deepen our own learning, to share our learning with others, to advocate for human rights? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Marie-Claude. Thank you so much for speaking to the human rights challenges within the Canadian context, systemic racism and discrimination, barriers faced by people living with disabilities, online hate and hate crimes, Indigenous rights and reconciliation. I'll just share a quick story before we move into the panel discussion. You know, you talked about how rights hits home for people, and human rights certainly hit home for our family and my daughter, my 7-year-old daughter in particular, last May. And I vividly remember where I was when news emerged of the 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops last May. And I was driving to my parents' house. They live in Nova Scotia. And my 7-year-old daughter was spending 4 weeks with them, really immersing herself in her heritage, in her culture, in the spirituality, in the food, in the stories, all of it. And I vividly remember the following 7 hours after we heard of the news was excruciatingly tough. And then on the way back, my partner and I really debated if we should share the news with our daughter. And we decided it was important that we do, and we did. And we had to pull over on the Trans-Canada Highway because my daughter started to cry, and then we all started to cry. And she really, at that point, and all of us really, I think, came to terms with our own privilege. And here I was I immigrated, my family immigrated from India when I was about 9, and the privileges that we have as settlers, my daughter spending time with her family, with her grandparents, that was a moment of acknowledging our own privilege. So I wanted to express that. Thank you so much. We now are moving to the discussion portion of the evening, and where we'll actually dive into some of these important topics. I would like to introduce our panelists this evening. We have Hillory Tenute, who is joining us here in person. Hillory is an Anishinaabe with settler descent from the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation, located in Nehishingming, Ontario, as part of the Saugan Ojibwe Nation territory in what we now call Canada. Hillory is the Executive Director at Canadian Roots Exchange, a national Indigenous youth-led organization that provides reconciliation-based programs, grants, and opportunities designed to strengthen and amplify the voices of Indigenous youth in Canada. Hillory has extensive experience in providing expertise on research, evaluation, and analysis of Indigenous realities, such as Indigenous settler relations, rights implementation, justice, health, and well-being. Welcome, Hillory.
Right.
We also have Rio Hada, who is joining us remotely. Rio is Chief of the Equality, Development, and Rule of Law section at the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Rio currently leads OHCHR's thematic engagement in New York on equality and non-discrimination, sustainable development, and the rule of law to mainstream human rights in interagency and intergovernmental discussions at the UN headquarters. Until recently, he was coordinating the OHCHR's global thematic work on economic, social, and cultural rights and the human rights of older persons. During 2006 to 2017, he led OHCHR's human rights mainstreaming agenda in the UN system and coordinated UN interagency efforts to integrate human rights in the policies and programs of the UN development system and to promote human rights-based implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Welcome, Rio. Okay, perfect. This is terrific. Hillory, I'd love to start with you. Do you see a greater role for human rights education in formal settings? There's been, Peter spoke about formal and informal settings, but I'm particularly curious about formal settings. And how do you think that, education in formal settings is important to advancing the journey in reconciliation?
Well, first, Team Miigwech for having me back. I always really appreciate these opportunities to talk about the work that we're doing. I think that there is such an integral role that it plays. And I believe you just took the quote right away from me, just about how, education is what got us here and education what's going to take us out of this situation. I also wanted to recognize when we really start to cultivate these understandings about the ways in which education plays with its role in reconciliation is really ensuring that folks who understand it is an everyday practice and it's ongoing. In a formal setting, though, it has so much impact. And I think what's really fascinating to that is that in the work that we do and the youth that we are so lucky and privileged to engage with, I'm fairly certain that almost every time we have an engagement, Indigenous youth are talking about the lack of basic human rights and basic Indigenous rights and an understanding of that in mainstream settler institutions like education, like the healthcare system, for example. And I think with that lack of institutional knowledge or that lack of understanding or empathy, as you spoke about it, we start to create more of a barrier for access for individuals. And I think we begin to see these more shifts in those of us wanting to speak up to not really having those spaces in which to do so because those systems are so set up against marginalized groups, or in the case of work that we do with Indigenous youth. And I think that there's still so much of this system of oppression that is entrenched within formal systems of education as well. So human rights education plays a significant role in advancing reconciliation, but not just between Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals. I think that there is such a formidable role that it plays in terms of advancing the humanistic rights and seeing the humanity of individuals, particularly in the Black Lives Movement, LGBTQ2S rights, in addition to Asian Canadian rights. And when we start to have human rights education embodied within these movements, we really begin to bridge the solidarity between these different disenfranchised groups. And that to me is a true testament of what reconciliation is going in what we now refer to as Canada. And so I think that it has, as human rights education, has such a profound impact in a multitude of different layers in formal education. And so for your last question, apologies, Vinod, I went on a bit of a rant there. I do really think that it plays such an integral role. And I think that, we spoke so much earlier too, just about the humanity aspect and the empathy aspect and how much that is lacking. And I think that that's such an important part of it.
Yeah, let me quickly follow up here. How would you like to see human rights education implemented in the formal education system?
I think again, I mean, we have seen a pretty big shift in it. And like, I come from the days of where, we had to hide into the stacks and do work on talking about reconciliation or as a form of human rights education. And I'm going to refer to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which is 1998. And so, it goes way, way back, but now I see it so often that we can see that online. And earlier today, I was speaking with a gentleman who was, talking more about the course that they took at University of Alberta. And, that really excites me, but I know that there's still a step beyond that. It still shocks me to this day in 2022, where I'm still discussing with Indigenous kin how often we are tokenized or how often we're still having to explain what the Indian residential schools was. And so there still is a lack out there. And, there should be such a bigger, stronger push for, provincial governments is really to implement and adopt this pathway that was developed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? It's all there for you to really see that more formalized in our education system and a stronger sense of understanding in the history of colonialism and the impacts that assimilation-based policies have on Indigenous kin today.
Right. Thank you, Hillory. Rio, I'm going to turn to you next. You've been a strong advocate for water and sanitation rights. You've asserted that whoever you are, wherever you are, water is your human right. Can you tell us how human rights education can be leveraged to help secure this very basic human right for all?
Yes. First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm really sorry that I could not be there in person. The weather was not in our favor today. Yes, a few years ago in 2019, this was before the pandemic, I was coordinating a global UN campaign on water for the World Water Day. And the theme of that year was on leaving no one behind and promoting a human rights-based approach to water and sanitation, putting spotlight on communities which do not enjoy safe drinking water, encouraging everyone to take actions for the realization of this essential right. And I had the pleasure of working with a wonderful Canadian water activist, Indigenous teenager from Anishinaabe Nation. You probably know her, Autumn Peltier. And her story was, I thought, was quintessential human rights education story. Autumn, when she was 8, visited an Indigenous community, and she was surprised to find out that they did not have access to safe drinking water. The water that they had was contaminated and not safe to drink unless you boil them first. And so there was a government advisory for boiling the water. And she began to think, wonder, and investigate why this is so. And basically she grew up trying to understand the importance of water, the special relations that Indigenous people have with water, land, and environment, and the need to protect them. And she advocates for the universal right to clean drinking water, raising awareness towards water rights, and ensuring community have access to clean, safe drinking water, which is a basic human right. And she's now, and this was 3 years ago, and she's now the Chief Water Commissioner for Anishinaabe Nation. She has spent nearly half of her life speaking about this importance of clean water at UN conferences. She has millions of followers on Instagram, and when she was 12, she even challenged Justin Trudeau on the policy failure to provide safe drinking water. So to me, the autumn story, and also from what Hillory was saying, the human rights education can take a variety of different forms. And human rights education is really a powerful tool to empower individuals, communities to become aware of their rights, understanding what are the norms and standards, and who have responsibility and be accountable for actions or inactions.
Thank you, Rio. Marie-Claude, over to you next. You've called attention to growing concerns generated by online hate and the toxic social atmosphere that can prevail in digital spaces. What role can human rights education play in ensuring that these narratives do not become the social norms that guide youth behavior?
Thank you for your question. This is a really important question. This is an urgent issue that we have been vocal for years, and I've been vocal personally for years, making many public statements on that. Hate speech and online hate violate the most basic human rights of people and the right to equality and having their life free of discrimination. Hate online and hate speech really shut down debates. It's a threat to democracy. Right. It silences people. It leads to real world violence, and we need to keep that in mind. It's really, again, a threat to democracy. Progress is happening in Canada, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And we have to get together. We have to address the legal gap that we're seeing in hate speech protection in Canada. Today, hate speech and hate is easier to find than ever. Everyone has the capacity with their phone and all the technology to be a broadcaster. Everyone has the capacity to put anything on the internet. And companies that can hold and have and promote online hate without any accountability, no legal accountability, which is a huge concern. I have children, 3, I have grandchildren, 3 as well. And they're all the time on the internet, on their devices. Right. They become the norm. They're playing games, they look for information, they search for things. Then what we want from them, what we want for them. And we cannot let that go. We cannot have them think that this is normal. Right. This is the normal now that we have in Canada. Then I think that we need to encourage them to become agent of change. There is no need to be at the head of the Canadian Human Rights Commission or any organization to be an agent of change. Not at all. Everyone in our day-to-day life, we can be an agent of change. Small gesture matter. And we can all intervene to do something and to say something and to step up. And just call people on what's going on actually. But it takes courage, a lot of courage to do so. And it takes courage to stand beside people. It takes courage to call out people who are doing things that they're inappropriate, to people who are bullying others. It takes a lot of courage, and we need to taught them this courage that they should have. And at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, although education is a provincial and territorial jurisdiction, it's not federal. We work in collaboration with our counterpart, the provincial and territorial Human Rights Commission all across Canada, but also with many organizations to do some work, some groundwork, and make sure that we raise awareness and we promote human rights as a core value, as a second nature, as something that we need to take care of, we need to cherish, we never should take for granted. Never, never, never.
And I'm curious, just as a quick follow-up, what are a couple of examples of the progress that you're seeing across the country?
But certainly, I think that people have access to education. They can. I think that they're aware.
Right.
But you know, with this capacity, there's a lot of good things that we can do with internet, with the devices, with all the technology actually. And this is progress. This is good progress. And we can reach out people that we're not used to be able to do so. But there is also the other consequences. And this is where we need to make sure that things will be done. We will educate people, we will educate our children, and everyone needs to play this role. Parents, educators, school, and it should be all over the place.
Right. Thank you. Hillory, over to you. Can you speak to a good practice in human rights education that has more recently emerged as successful?
Yes. So this is actually one that we started talking about when we were in Geneva, and I was sad that we didn't get to keep the conversation going around it. So one of the best practices that I would see in something, especially in the work that we do, is around the accessibility of language. So much of when I speak, for example, you know, I do often get told like, oh, you have a very casual tone about it. It's not very academic. And I truly appreciate that after all my years of, going to post-secondary and my master's. But largely, and I speak in a way because I want our Indigenous youth, that's not to say that they can't understand these tools. Like, I'm not suggesting that at all. But it needs to be accessible. Right. So if our youth are going to be the ones that dismantle these systems of oppression, I need them to know what they're trying to dismantle. And the systems are set up in such a way that they are inaccessible to most people. I'm going to use a really great example. We had the privilege more recently to be up in Iqaluit, and we were working with some Indigenous youth there. And we're working on the United Declaration Rights of Indigenous People. And I was reading some of the text that was provided to us from our partnership at Justice Canada. And I understand it has to be written in a certain language, but I was reading, I was like, I don't even know what they're asking, you know? And so, but what was fun though, we really got to take that as an opportunity about how can we work with the youth as well as ourselves to really understand, like, what are we trying to get across here? So if we want Indigenous youth, or we want the youth that we're working with in this case to really understand their rights as Indigenous people and why this document would be applicable to them, well, we have to get them to understand what their rights are. So we did this really beautiful exercise where we went around the room and we asked the youth, you know, what makes you proud to be a Nook? And they all went around and they talked about survivors, being a survivor and resiliency and all of these things that are these stories and this legacy work that has been passed on them from generations to generations. And I'm just in the corner just crying because it was the most beautiful thing ever. But it was such a true example of how accessible this language needs to be. And we began to talk about it in Geneva. I think that is a really wonderful, promising practice that needs to be adopted more, because in order for us to have marginalized groups and those that are disenfranchised to come to the table that they so deserve to be at to make these changes in, say, the country, like here in, or what we now refer to as Canada, they have to understand what it is, this legacy work that they're inheriting. And so I would say that is like one of the biggest accessibility of language and tools.
Right. Yeah. Just last week, I hosted a plenary session at Cooperation Canada's International Cooperation Futures Festival. And it was with young change makers who were, you know, some of them were 12 years old, some 15, and the conversation was about the intergenerational effects of global cooperation and humanitarian work. And one of the things I've always wanted to ask you this question, so I'm going to put this on the table now, is how can we begin to talk about the rights of future peoples? You know, I think this is a very important thing that's now coming to, you know, all of our work has intergenerational effects. Mm-hmm. And what does it look like to begin to talk about the rights of future people?
That is a really great question, and I am so glad you waited to this moment to ask me this on the spot. No, truthfully though, I think so often, if I understand what you're asking, I think so often than not, when we are discussing this future of Canada, and we really are looking at, again, I can only come from the context of working with Indigenous youth. We tend to really lean in towards these deficits that we're trying to create. And I think the piece that we don't lean into enough are Indigenous futurisms, and what we really do see is the next 7 generations, and really providing space for that, to cultivate that. We're always trying to have band-aid solutions to giant wounds in this country. And I think we really do need to look to the youth, who are really this driving force, to say, no, this is what I believe to be true. This is what I see. And I mean, we saw the clip earlier, and it's this beautiful teaching that whenever I'm having a really low point, I know my mom always reminds me, like, you know, remember, my girl, you are the prayers of your ancestors. And I feel the same to be true about this next generation, is that now the futurisms and the seeds that they're planting and all this work, this is the future of the next 7 generations. And so we just really need to make more space for that. And I'm so grateful that our organization really does that work. I think more should. And I think that with more shifts within mainstream education, for example, I think we really can see some really, I mean, Indigenous youth are the leaders of this country. And so really putting our feet to the fire, making sure that happens.
Right.
Did that answer your question?
Thank you. That was beautiful. Yeah. Ria, I want to sort of turn to you next. COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on older persons. Can you highlight how practices in human rights education have helped protect older persons in a way that is respectful of their dignity and socioeconomic rights?
Yes, we've been talking a lot about young people, and I'd like to get to that, but let me just take a brief moment to talk about older persons. Naturally, we all age without exception, right? Every day, every year, we are older, and the whole world is getting older. By 2050, a quarter of the world population will be 65 and older. But somehow there's this notion of that aging is something undesirable or to be avoided, or older people are somehow less valued or economic burden in a society. And tragically, at the beginning of the COVID, we have seen that some older people were not prioritized and did not have access to life-saving equipment. And these are all examples of ageism, which is so widespread in a society and often tolerated or even accepted. So last year, UN issued the first ever global report on ageism to gather evidence and how to tackle ageism, which found that 1 in 2 persons have an ageist attitude. And ageism is not just about older people, but of course also about young people as well. And ageism has significant impact not only on one's physical and mental health, but to society and economy. One estimate shows that ageism costs society billions of dollars. So what can we do about this? How can we combat ageism? First, we need to have a better laws and policy to protect older people, but currently there are significant gaps. At the UN, member states are discussing to develop a new international human rights convention on older persons, but we still have a long way to go. So here is where educational intervention, particularly human rights education, becomes very critical. Many older people have significant gaps in understanding their rights, and other people may not understand the rights of older persons or have the full appreciation of their potential to contribute to society. The COVID pandemic, as much as it had a tragic impact on older persons, on the other hand, I think it helped to raise the visibility of older persons and awareness about their special needs and concerns, as well as potentials. Organizations in Canada, like International Federation of Aging here in Toronto, or the International Longevity Center Canada in Ottawa, they're doing tremendous work to educate people, raise awareness about older persons, bring in different expertise together to empower and bring the voices of older persons to policy making. And I also want to emphasize the importance of intergenerational contact, that what you were talking about when it comes to human rights education of older people. During COVID, there are many examples of young people helping older ones with digital technology. That interaction has also benefited young people in many ways. Older people have tremendous knowledge and life experience to guide our future generation. Autumn Peltier, the young woman that I mentioned, she received much of her knowledge and inspiration from her great aunt, who was the chief water protector. So human rights education can serve to strengthen this intergenerational solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ario. That was a stark statistic there. One in two have an ageist attitude. Lots to take in there. Marie-Claude, I'd like to turn to you next. You've asserted that every person in Canada should be able to see themselves in the human rights system, use it in a meaningful way, and trust that it will result in a meaningful outcome. How can human rights education help achieve this for all Canadians?
Oh, but human rights education is really important to promote and facilitate access to justice, and access to justice for all, not just for some, and to remove barrier through awareness. In fact, we can think about schools where human rights education introduce children to their rights and empower them to speak up about issues and rights, their rights, but rights of others. Workplaces, in fact, where training empower employees to seek redress when they face violation for their rights or they see some violations, and where we can also create a safe space to have conversation, an uncomfortable conversation about situation like racism and systemic racism and many other grounds of discrimination, in fact, through public institutions such as the CHRC, Human Rights Promotion and Awareness Initiative that contribute to important shift of culture that support broader access to justice. I think that we must have the courage to get to know each other as well, to know and humanize one another, in fact, to identify our blind spots, which is not necessarily easy, but it's a need. We need to educate ourselves and do a little bit of introspection. We need to be vulnerable, in fact, and to admit that we do not necessarily have all the answer, and we need to be curious instead of being furious, to get to know each other, in fact. And I like to quote Henry David Thoreau, who said that could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant? And would we treat each other differently? And I think that this is something that we always need to keep in mind. In fact, instead of having a snap judgment, instead of judging someone's reaction or someone maybe overreaction, it's maybe just ask ourselves, in fact, if I would have been in his shoes, you know, maybe I will have treated this person differently. I always say that access to justice means a meaningful participation in the system where you can see yourself and you can trust that you will find a fair solution, a fair outcome to your situation. That is what access to justice means. Access to justice is not about one day in court. It's about being able to participate in a process that will provide you with solution and with a good outcome. That you will feel that you have been heard and you feel that this is something that is credible to you in your context, with your own situation. This is what it really means.
Yeah, love it. I'm curious instead of being furious. Just as a follow-up, in the Canadian context, what practices in human rights education should we be prioritizing?
Oh, it's certainly.
Is there one practice that you'd highlight?
In human rights education?
Yeah.
There is many. In fact, I don't think that for me, it's really take a human rights lens approach. Right. I would say that if people can learn to have this human rights lens approach, they're gonna learn to be curious instead of furious. They're gonna learn that, you know, what I'm seeing through my own lens is not necessarily what is the reality for others. And I think that if there is one human rights approach that is the good one, is to have this human rights lens approach. Because no matter if you discuss about security, no matter if you discuss about any subject, that if you have this approach in mind, that you're going to see the big picture and you're going to see the broad context.
Yeah, thank you. Ria, I have a quick question for you. Given the current socio-political context and the challenges we face as a global society, challenges related to the pandemic, armed conflicts, high cost of living, etc., what practices in human rights education should we be prioritizing in a global context? Is there a key practice that you would highlight?
Yes, in today's increasingly polarized and unequal world, I think human rights education and training should not be just a nice optional extra, but should be a priority that should be pursued by everybody, by the international community and all states. I would highlight, once again, the important priority on young people. At the UN, in recent years, there's much focus and priority on future generations, as you said, because young people are bringing forward a force of activism that can change the world. And how that activism is shaped in young people's formative years, human rights education plays a very important role here. Having access to human rights education at the time when one develops their values, begin to explore what it means to be a member of the community, this can all have significant impact in shaping and strengthening their activism. Conversely, when young people have no such educational opportunities, no prospects of decent work, no hope for better life, it becomes a breeding ground for extremism, violence, and conflict. And we have seen from the history examples of this. So I see the priority task of human rights education as equipping young people with knowledge, skills, and attitudes that foster respect, equality, justice, and solidarity. And as I emphasized before, we should not just focus on young people only, but reflect on the state of the world at present, what the history and lessons from older generations can teach us, and what actions we have to take now for future generations. And I think this is what it means to build future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rio. A quick question to you, Hillory. In your view, what is a key criterion for determining good practice in human rights education?
I think definitely ensuring that we're centering the voices of those who don't have access to rights or to safety. I think that's a huge component of it. Yeah, and I'll leave it. I feel like so much of what I wanted to say was sprinkled throughout, so I'll leave it at that. I'll keep it brief.
Okay, super. Thank you. As we sort of wrap up, we've got a few minutes left. There is a final sort of lightning round. So please keep your responses brief, but maybe perhaps we can start with you, Marie-Claude. How can we make the respect of human rights for all more of a priority for those who continue to resist it?
I would say for the most resistant cynic people is being more inclusive will help your competitive edge, in my view, will help to attract the top talent, will help to be more innovative and creative in your organization, and will help to contribute to Canada's economic recovery and prosperity. It's true. It's clear for me. It is not just the right things to do, this is the smart thing to do. This is what people should do.
Yeah. Let's see. Rio, same question over to you.
Yes, I'd like to go back to what Marie-Claude said in the beginning, quoting from Eleanor Roosevelt: universal human rights starts in small places close to home. We all need to know our rights, who's at stake, who's left behind, and who has responsibility to provide those rights and hold them to account. So we need to be active in our own country, community, talking to governments, elected representatives, raising awareness, shaping public opinions, and importantly, sharing our experience and good practices, like what we have been doing with EquiTalks, with this compendium.
Super. Yeah. Hillory, you have the last word.
Again, so much of what I had shared, but I think just ensuring that these human rights education is more of a mandatory process in multiple institutions. I also want to note something too. I know, Marie-Claude, you had mentioned earlier, you said a quote about empathy breeds action, and I couldn't agree with that more. And I think too, so much more needs to be done within this country, and that was ever more present this past September 30th. And you know, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination suggesting that our organization is sort of the index or marker of whether people are still committing to truth and reconciliation in this country. But without the polarization of, you know, the stories that we shared earlier on about the recovery of the graves, it was very quiet in our organization this year. And I heard an elder once say too, maybe everyone bought their orange shirts already. Or maybe they just had too many of those trauma donuts at Tim Hortons. But it was really, it was very interesting to see that. And I know I spoke with other communities too and other organizations, and we all said it was really quiet this year. So I really hope that people are still keeping their feet to the fire and keeping this work going, because, you know, it's going to take us 100 years to get out of it. But so ensuring that human rights education is at the forefront too.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a couple of minutes for Q&A. Do we have questions from our online attendees? Yeah. Oh, terrific. Okay. Amazing. So we have a question from online participant Andrew Cardozo. How do you suggest involving people in human rights education for those who are either not interested, busy with other things, or don't believe they need it? Who would like to kick off here? Marie-Claude? Yeah.
You know, I mentioned in my remark that, you know, when it do not touch us directly, sometimes we do not feel that we're connected to issue. And I think that we need to find a way to connect them to what can happen to their sibling, their daughter, than their parents. And it's to bring this human face to situation. And this is one of the things that we have done at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, is changing the way completely that we are doing, as an example, annual reports and these kind of things, instead of having boring numbers and things. It's really to work with stakeholders and people who have gone through difficult situations and shine a light on how they were successful through the human rights system, as an example, to resolve it, or what kind of situation that they face and how it have impact people. That I think that we need to put a human face on situation, that it helps us to connect.
Hillory, what do you think?
I think that's a great response. Accessibility as well, making maybe human rights more exciting, like yeah, marketing wise, I'm not sure. But as well as, I mean, to me, it's like a bigger systems issue, right? Dismantling white supremacy. I mean, that's the bigger one for us. But yeah, definitely accessibility, I think too, and that'll really, I hope, touch others as well, so they understand why they're doing it.
Super, thank you. Rio, any thoughts on this question?
Yes, I agree with Marie-Claude and others that you know, you really have to put yourself in the context and connect with the people. You know, not just start with the human rights education, but you know, let's talk about water and how that relates to human rights, or you know, and so just understanding where that person comes from and having discussion groups to you know, zoom in on what the human rights links to those what the person is thinking or doing is key.
Perfect. Do we have a question here from anyone? Go ahead.
Part of my job is helping them to track measure and report. It's something that I get asked a lot, which I won't do at the end, because I know that it's still between communication and rights to say different things, but we use that framework to get
right.
So I get asked a lot, age where do I start? Because I did a lot of startup people who were just set up with, let's say an exchange, so quit their job, starting a program, starting their own organization, so they don't know where to start. So they ask me where to start. And the other question I get asked a lot is, but it's international. I did, I have a little shop or I'm setting a little, organization. How do you have workshop? How do I implement it don't seem like it seems to see that there's a disconnect between the right to speak a lot of them have different actually that's the perspective of the other thing that start to get a bit
Can I just repeat the question here? I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just going to play it back a little bit. So I think the question is has to do with the the Sustainable Development Goals. That's very much seen as a global construct. What is the local applicability, and in particular for smaller organizations like startups and smaller social purpose organizations? How might they, with all the things that they are doing, how might they begin to embed human rights education as part of the work that they do in advancing the SDGs? Did I? Okay, wonderful. Yeah, Marie-Claude.
It's a good question, and I think that, as I mentioned, I don't think that we need to be at the head of any organization to start this work. First, it starts with self-awareness, with educate ourselves, reading, and human rights. Yes, there's a lot of material that is international, but it starts home, it starts in school, it starts, as I quote Eleanor Roosevelt, in fact, it starts in every small gesture. And the workplace is the same thing, it starts with creating a safe space where we can have conversation about that and making sure that we value and we give a seat at the table to everyone to share their own experience, but created this safe space to share the experience that they have to share. It's really about encouraging people to read and to read story and to reach out some organizations who are good at that and can help you with that. I'm often invited as a chief commissioner to give presentation. I never talk about training because I do not provide training, but what I'm doing as a chief commissioner is I share my experience and the lesson learned. I think that it's to start by listening, learning, and after that you can take action. And it's true for every organization, small, medium, or large one, that it's really that. And I'll be more than happy to engage in a further conversation with you to give you some we start somehow at the commission, our journey, the shift of culture. It was baby step, and meaningful change takes time. We have to keep that in mind as well. We cannot do everything. It's not one-shot deal. It's an ongoing journey that will take time to create meaningful change that will have really an impact. But it starts with people. We can have policies, directives, laws. It's worth nothing if people doesn't want to engage and have these conversations. And people just need, again, to have a safe space to have these conversations where they're going to feel that they will be respected, listen, and action will be taken.
Quickly, Rio, I know you work in the UN system, so what's your response to this?
Yes, and of course, human rights education is part of the Sustainable Development Goal, and there has been a lot of recognition at the international level, a lot of good developments in terms of normative with the UN Declaration and all. But what comes down to it, all of these commitment has to be implemented at the local community level. And this is what needs to really happen now. And that's why we've been encouraging this sharing of good practices. And I think documenting those practices and impactful stories, we believe will hopefully encourage others as a source of inspiration. And here is perhaps the UN, the World Program on Human Rights Education and Training. It can serve as a common collective framework for action and opportunity to interact with each other. And we welcome everybody to collaborate and contribute to this initiative. Thank you.
That just, was really meaningful. And, a tree is planted 20 years ago. And I think that was really telling, and I loved it. And so thank you, Erica, if you're watching. No, but I felt like, as much to echo what you were saying too, it is that these things take time, and it always starts with the relationship and creating a space for people to feel included and safe and brave enough to come forward. So I'll just leave it at that.
Just in interest of time, I think we've got time for one more question. Yeah, and it's a juicy question. So Marie-Claude, we'll start with you. How do you feel about the direction human rights is taking at the moment? Are we headed in the right direction?
I have huge concern and huge hope. I have hope when I'm seeing young people taking the street and do what they have to do to stand for what they believe in.
Right.
I have huge concern. I'm scared when I'm seeing the political rhetoric and the polarization of the discourse. But I think that I still believe that there is hope. People can build on what we can build on what we're seeing, the courage of young people and people who are stand for what they really believe in.
Right.
And I would say that for me, it's remaining vigilant. And again, not taking anything for granted.
Yeah. Rio?
Yes, unfortunately, the world is increasingly becoming divided and becoming extreme, not just in terms of climate, but politically. So I really hope that human rights education can be a bridging force between generations, between cultures, and society, and to bring this universal rights into everybody's home.
Thank you. Hillory, you have the last word. Are we headed in the right direction?
Depends on what's in the news, but I'm really hopeful, and I really believe in Indigenous youth being the future of this country. And I really believe in my ancestors' teaching to get us where we are, and this legacy work that now we've all inherited. It is a scary place out there. It absolutely is, but I see acts of human kindness on a day-to-day basis. And so those are moments that I'm really hopeful for. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Brilliant. Rio, Marie-Claude, Hillory, thank you so much for making time for us this evening. I've learned a ton, lots of really, really insightful perspectives, from ageist attitudes to accessibility of language to Indigenous futurisms and being curious instead of furious, all of it. Absolutely insightful. I'd like to now introduce Andre Beaulieu to help close the conversation this evening. Andre is the Senior Vice President of Corporate Services at Bell and Chair of the EquiTalks Board of Directors. Andre has also worked with the Privy Council Office of the Government of Canada and with the United Nations Conference of Environment and Development. An active member of the community, Andre also sits on the board of the Montreal Children's Hospital Foundation, the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations, and the Public Policy Forum. Over to you, Andre.
Very kind. You guys can hear me? I didn't know we were going to go through the bio. I would have canceled it if I had known. It's a pleasure for me to welcome everyone this evening. Merci d'être venu tout le monde. You guys must be familiar with the three B's of closing statements. Be bright, be brief, and be gone. So that's my intention for this evening. I want to thank Peter for his opening remark, very heartfelt. Our panelists, Rio and Hillory, when I started becoming involved in international development 30 years ago, the new master word was capacity building. I think we heard a lot from you about what we should be doing here, and from Rio about what should happen around the world. Notre invitée d'honneur, Madame la Commissaire Landry, merci. Not only for tonight, but for decades of involvement in defense of human rights. I want to thank our sponsors and partners for this evening. TD Bank, who's been a partner with Bell for many, many years, a key partner also for our Canadian program, which we didn't discuss much this evening. Power Corporation of Canada, another longtime partner, BGIS, Vertigo, as well as Transelec, another partner, and the Government of Canada, who's always has long been a partner of EquiTalks. Of course, I want to thank everyone who came this evening to participate in our event, the group in the room, but also the more than 80 people who joined online. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I thought the discussions this evening were a true reflection of the values that carry EquiTalks and have for more than 55 years now. So I hope we can continue on the support of everyone who participated this evening in defense of social justice and human rights. We were very fortunate to have Vinod as our moderator, one of the most important voices in the country on these issues. And whichever way this support takes, we're grateful for it. And we thank you for being with us this evening. Merci tout le monde.